My parents erased me from every family photo, then the museum called my name. The night my mother burned every photo of me, I was standing right outside the kitchen window, watching the flames eat my own face. I was 34 years old. I had flown home for my father's 60th birthday, carrying a gift I had chosen with more care than anything I had ever bought. Through the glass, I watched my mother drop photograph after photograph into a metal bucket on the stove. My father stood beside her, arms crossed, nodding, as if this was something they had planned together, calmly over coffee. My sister Diane filmed it on her phone, laughing. I did not walk inside. I did not scream. I stood in the cold, watching 20 years of my own childhood turn into gray smoke, and something in me went very quiet. That quiet would take me 11 years to fully understand. It would take a phone call from a museum curator and a photograph nobody could explain to finally break it open. This is the story of how a family tried to erase me and how the truth found its way back into every frame. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I grew up in a small town outside Portland, Maine, in a house that always smelled like cedar and rain. My father, Robert, ran a hardware store on Main Street. My mother, Susan, taught piano to half the children in town. My younger sister, Diane, was the golden child, the one who never had to try, the one whose report cards were taped to the refrigerator while mine were folded into drawers. I was the quiet one. The one who read too much, asked too many questions, and never quite fit the shape my parents wanted for a daughter. I loved photography from the time I was 9 years old, when my grandfather gave me his old Pentax camera and taught me how to load the film in the dark. I would spend hours in our backyard, photographing the light through the maple trees, the way frost formed patterns on the porch railing, the way my mother's hands moved when she played Chopin. For a while, that love of photography made me special in our house. My parents hung my pictures in the hallway. My father bragged about me at the store. Then, when I was 17, everything changed. It happened after the county fair photography contest. I entered a black and white portrait of an elderly farmer named Mr. Doyle, sitting on his porch with his hands folded, looking out at fields he had worked his whole life. I won first place. The local newspaper ran the photo on the front page, with my name under it in bold letters. Diane, who was 15 at the time, had entered a painting in the same contest. She did not place at all. That night, my mother did not congratulate me. She sat me down at the kitchen table, her face tight, and said something I have never forgotten. You need to think about how this makes your sister feel, Claire. Not everything has to be about you. I remember staring at her, confused, because I had not asked for the front page. I had not asked to win. I had simply taken a photograph of an old man's tired, kind face, and somehow that had become a crime against my sister's feelings. From that day forward, something shifted in our house. It was subtle at first. My photographs slowly disappeared from the hallway, replaced by Diane's paintings. My father stopped mentioning my name at the store. When relatives visited, conversations would circle around Diane's grades, Diane's boyfriend, Diane's plans for college, and I would sit at the edge of the room, waiting for someone to ask me a single question. I told myself it was in my head. I told myself families were complicated, and maybe I was too sensitive, too much like my grandfather, who had also loved cameras and had also, according to my mother, been a difficult man. I went to college in Boston on a partial scholarship, studying art history and photography. My parents did not come to my graduation. They said the drive was too long and, besides, Diane had a dance recital that same weekend. I sat in a folding chair in a crowded auditorium, watching other students hug their families, and I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was strong enough to build a life without their approval. For the next several years, I built a career slowly and carefully. I worked as an assistant in a small gallery in Boston, then moved to New York to work under a well-known photo editor named Martin Cho. I learned everything I could about the history of photography, about restoration, about the strange, quiet power that a single image can hold over an entire family's memory. I called home on birthdays and holidays. Sometimes my mother answered and spoke to me in short, clipped sentences, as if she were doing me a favor by staying on the line. Sometimes my father would take the phone for exactly 90 seconds, ask if I was eating enough, and then say he had to go check on something at the store. Diane rarely called at all, but I would see her updates online, smiling in family photos at holidays I had not been invited to. I told myself that was normal too. Grown children drift from their families. Not every sister is close. Not every parent calls every week. Then came my father's 60th birthday. My mother called me 2 months in advance, her voice warmer than it had been in years, and asked if I would come home for the party. She said it would mean so much to your father. She said the whole family would be there. For the first time in a long while, I let myself hope. I booked a flight. I spent weeks choosing a gift, finally settling on a framed print I had made myself, a photograph of my father as a young man, standing in front of the hardware store the week it opened. A photo I had found in an old box at my grandmother's house and carefully restored using techniques I had learned in New York. I imagined handing it to him. I imagined his face when he saw himself young again, full of hope, before the years had worn him down. I imagined, foolishly, that this gift might be the thing that finally brought me back into the family. I arrived a day early to surprise them. I did not call ahead. I parked down the street and walked up through the side yard, planning to knock on the kitchen door the way I always had as a child. That is when I saw them through the window. My mother stood at the stove, a metal bucket in front of her, dropping photographs into it one by one. I recognized some of them even through the glass. A photo of me at my 8th grade graduation. A photo of me holding my first camera. A photo from a Christmas morning when I was maybe 10 years old, wearing a red sweater my grandmother had knitted. My father stood beside her, watching, occasionally handing her another photo from a stack on the counter. Diane stood a few feet away, phone raised, recording, laughing at something my mother had said that I could not hear through the glass. I did not move. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough for the smoke from the bucket to curl up past the window and disappear into the evening sky. Long enough for my legs to go numb from the cold. Long enough to understand, with a clarity that felt like ice water down my spine, that this was not an accident, and this was not a moment of confusion. This was a decision. My family had decided, together, calmly, that I no longer belonged in their story. I got back in my car and drove to a motel outside town. I did not call anyone. I did not cry, not that night. I simply sat on the edge of a stiff motel bed, staring at the framed photograph I had made for my father, the one of him young and hopeful in front of his store, and I understood that I would never give it to him. I drove home to New York the next morning without seeing any of them. For weeks afterward, I moved through my days like a woman underwater. I went to work. I answered emails. I smiled at colleagues. But at night, I would lie awake replaying the scene through that window, trying to understand what I had done to deserve it. Had I been too proud of my work? Too independent? Too much like my grandfather, a man my mother had once called, in a moment of anger, the kind of person who thinks the world owes him attention just because he can point a camera at something? I did not call my parents. I did not send a birthday card the following year. For the first time in my life, I let the silence between us grow instead of trying to close it. It was Diane who eventually broke that silence, 3 years later, with a single text message that read, "Mom's been asking about you. Maybe you could stop being so dramatic and call her sometime." I did not respond. Something inside me had finally, quietly, closed. I threw myself into my work instead. I left the gallery job and started my own photo restoration and archival business, specializing in historical family collections, community archives, and forgotten photography from small towns across New England. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required patience and respect for other people's stories. I traveled to old churches, county historical societies, and private estate sales, buying boxes of unlabeled photographs that families no longer wanted, restoring them, researching their history, and placing them where they belonged, in museums, in local archives, in books about forgotten American towns. There was a strange comfort in this work. I spent my days rescuing images that other people had thrown away, giving them back their names, their context, their place in history. I told myself it did not matter that my own family had done the opposite to me. I told myself I had built something meaningful out of the wreckage. 7 years passed this way. I built a small but respected reputation in my field. I published a photography book about mill towns in Maine that had once thrived and then been forgotten. I gave a few lectures at universities. I was, by any outside measure, doing well. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, I received a phone call that would change everything. The call came from a woman named Eleanor Vance, senior curator at the Northeast Regional Museum of American Life, a respected institution in Boston known for its collections on New England history, industry, and family life across 3 centuries. I had worked with the museum before, restoring a handful of pieces for a rotating exhibit 2 years earlier, so at first I assumed this was simply another restoration job. "Claire," Eleanor said, her voice careful, almost hesitant, "I need you to come in and look at something. It's a bit unusual." "Unusual how?" "We recently acquired a private collection from an estate sale in Maine. Old photographs, going back decades, mostly unlabeled. My team has been cataloging them for an upcoming exhibit on small-town American families. And Claire, your name is on one of them." I felt my stomach tighten. My name? Written on the back. In pencil. Along with a date and a location. "I think you should come see it in person." I drove to Boston that same afternoon, my hands tight on the steering wheel the entire way, my mind racing through a dozen possibilities, none of which prepared me for what I would actually find. Eleanor met me in the museum's back research room, a quiet space filled with archival boxes, white gloves, and the particular hush of old paper. She led me to a table where a single photograph sat inside a protective plastic sleeve. It was a black and white photo, slightly faded, showing a young girl of about 9 years old, sitting on a porch step, holding a camera almost as big as her own torso, grinning at whoever was behind the lens. I recognized the porch instantly. It was my grandfather's porch, the one attached to the small house where he had lived until his death when I was 12. I recognized the girl, too. It was me. I turned the photo over with trembling hands. On the back, in pencil, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, was written, "Claire, age 9, first photograph. She has the eye. Do not let this family forget her." The handwriting belonged to my grandfather. "Where did this collection come from?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Eleanor explained that the photographs had come from the estate of a woman named Margaret Doyle, who had recently passed away at the age of 91. Margaret Doyle had been a longtime resident of our town, a retired schoolteacher who had, for decades, collected local photography as a kind of unofficial town historian. Her family had donated her entire collection to the museum after her death, thousands of images documenting ordinary life in small Maine towns across 60 years. I sat very still, trying to understand how a photograph of me, taken on my grandfather's porch, had ended up in Margaret Doyle's collection. And then I remembered. Mr. Doyle. The elderly farmer I had photographed for the county fair contest when I was 17. Margaret Doyle had been his sister. She had seen my winning photograph in the newspaper and, according to the museum's notes, had reached out to my grandfather afterward, impressed by my work, asking if she could see more of it. My grandfather, it seemed, had given her copies of several of my earliest photographs, along with his own handwritten notes about my talent, hoping perhaps that someone outside our family would recognize what he saw in me. "There's more," Eleanor said gently. "We found nearly 40 photographs credited to you, spanning your childhood through your college years. Landscapes, portraits, some technical studies." Margaret kept detailed notes on local photographers she admired. She wrote quite extensively about your early work. She believed you were going to become someone important in this field. I sat in that quiet research room and wept for the first time in years, not from sadness, but from something closer to shock, the strange, overwhelming feeling of being seen by someone I had never fully appreciated while she was alive. Eleanor let me sit with the photographs for a long time before she spoke again. "We'd like to build a small exhibit around this collection," she finally said. "A section dedicated to overlooked American photographers, ordinary people whose work deserves recognition. Given the story behind these photos, and given your career today, we think your work belongs in it. We'd like to feature you, Claire. Your childhood photographs, your grandfather's notes, and a retrospective of the career you built afterward." I did not answer right away. I was still holding the photograph of myself at 9 years old, the camera nearly as big as my chest, my grandfather's handwriting on the back like a message sent across time. "Do not let this family forget her." I thought about the bucket of ashes in my mother's kitchen. I thought about 11 years of silence. And for the first time, I understood that I did not need to seek revenge through anger or confrontation. The truth had been waiting, patiently, in a shoebox in an old schoolteacher's attic, for exactly the right moment to return. "Yes," I told Eleanor. "I'll do it." Over the following months, I worked closely with the museum team to build the exhibit. We called it Unseen Hands, Photographers America Forgot. My section featured 12 of my childhood photographs alongside 12 photographs from my professional career, showing the direct line between the girl on my grandfather's porch and the woman who had spent over a decade restoring and preserving the visual history of small American towns. Beside my photographs, framed in simple black wood, was a printed copy of my grandfather's handwritten note, displayed exactly as Margaret Doyle had preserved it. I did not tell my parents about the exhibit. I did not tell Diane. Part of me wanted to protect this moment, to keep it entirely mine, untouched by the family that had tried to erase me. But another part of me, a quieter and more strategic part, understood that some truths do not need to be announced. They simply need to exist in the open, where the right people will eventually find them. The exhibit opened on a Saturday morning in early October. The museum had done modest local promotion, a press release, a small feature in the Boston Globe's arts section, a mention on the regional public radio station. I did not expect a large crowd. I certainly did not expect what actually happened. The Boston Globe feature included a photograph of my grandfather's note, along with a short biography explaining that I had grown up in a small town outside Portland, the granddaughter of a local photographer who had believed in my talent long before the world recognized it. The article did not mention my parents by name. It did not need to. Anyone from our town who read it would immediately understand whose granddaughter I was and whose daughter I was. Within a week, the article had been shared widely across local social media groups from our hometown. People I had not spoken to in 20 years began commenting, remembering me as a child with a camera always around her neck, remembering my grandfather fondly, expressing pride that someone from their small town had photographs hanging in a Boston museum. And then, inevitably, someone tagged my mother. I do not know exactly what was said in that thread, because I never went looking for it myself. But 2 weeks after the exhibit opened, I received an email from Diane. It had been 11 years since we had spoken directly. The email was short. "Everyone in town is talking about your exhibit. Mom is upset. She says you're trying to embarrass the family. Is that really why you did this?" I read that message several times, feeling something settle inside me, cold and clear. My family had burned every photograph of me they could find, had erased me from every wall and every album and every conversation for over a decade, and now, the moment the world began to recognize my work, their first instinct was to accuse me of trying to embarrass them. I wrote back a single sentence. "I didn't do this to embarrass anyone. I did it because someone finally kept what you threw away." I did not hear from Diane again for several months. The exhibit ran for 4 months and drew far more visitors than the museum had originally projected, in part because local New England news outlets picked up the story of the schoolteacher who had quietly preserved forgotten photography for 60 years, and the young photographer whose family had tried to erase her from their own history. A regional television station reached out and asked to do a short segment on the exhibit. I agreed, on the condition that the segment focus on Margaret Doyle's legacy as a town historian, not on my family. The segment aired on a Thursday evening in December. I did my best to keep the interview professional and measured, speaking about photography, about the importance of preserving ordinary lives, about the strange gift of finding my own childhood work waiting for me in a stranger's collection. I mentioned my grandfather with warmth and gratitude. I did not mention my parents at all. But cameras capture more than words. During the segment, they showed a slow pan across the exhibit wall, lingering on the photograph of me at 9 years old, holding my grandfather's camera, grinning on that porch. Beneath it, his handwritten note was displayed for the entire viewing audience to read. "Do not let this family forget her." I later learned, from a cousin who still lived in town, that my mother watched that segment sitting in her living room, the same living room where family photographs had once hung on every wall, now filled instead with paintings and awards belonging to Diane. According to my cousin, my mother said nothing for several minutes after the segment ended. She simply sat very still, staring at the muted television screen. I want to be honest about something here, because this is not a simple story of villains and heroes. I did not build this exhibit as an act of revenge. I built it because Margaret Doyle had given me back a piece of myself that I thought was lost forever, and I owed it to her, and to my grandfather, to honor what they had preserved. But I would be lying if I said there was no satisfaction in knowing that the truth had found its way back into the open, through no scheming of my own, simply because someone had cared enough to save what my family had tried to destroy. 3 weeks after the television segment aired, my father called me. I almost did not answer. His name flashed on my screen for the first time in 11 years, and my hand hovered over the phone for a long moment before I finally picked it up. His voice sounded older than I remembered, rougher around the edges, uncertain in a way I had never heard from him before. "Claire," he said. "I saw the segment. About the museum." I did not say anything at first. I simply waited. "Your grandfather always said you had something special," he continued. "I used to agree with him, before things got complicated with your mother and your sister." "Complicated," I repeated quietly. "Is that what we're calling it?" There was a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, could hear, somewhere in the background, the faint sound of a radio playing in what I assumed was still the same kitchen where I had watched my childhood burn. "I should have stopped her," he finally said. "The night with the photographs. I should have said something. I told myself it was easier not to. Your mother gets an idea in her head, and once she does, there's no talking her out of it." I told myself I was keeping the peace. I think I was just being a coward. I sat down slowly on the edge of my couch, my chest tight, unsure whether I wanted to hear an apology or whether it was simply 11 years too late to matter. "Why no?" I asked. "Why call me now after everything instead of any of the birthdays or holidays or graduations you missed?" "Because I finally saw it," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I saw the photograph of you on your grandfather's porch, and I remembered taking you to buy that camera. I remembered how happy you were. And I realized we didn't erase you from the family, Claire. We erased ourselves from your life. You built something beautiful without us. We're the ones who lost something." I did not cry during that phone call. I had already done my crying months earlier in that quiet research room in Boston, holding a photograph my grandfather had saved specifically so that someday someone would remember me. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him carefully. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not interested in going back to pretending none of this happened. If you want any kind of relationship with me moving forward, it has to be honest. It has to include what actually happened, not a version where everyone quietly agrees to forget it." "I understand," he said. "Your mother isn't ready for that kind of honesty. I don't know if she ever will be. But I am. I'd like to try, if you'll let me." We talked for almost an hour that evening, longer than we had spoken in over a decade combined. It was not a perfect conversation. There were long pauses, moments where old defensiveness crept back into his voice, moments where I had to remind him, gently but firmly, that an apology does not erase 11 years of silence. it simply opens the door to rebuilding something new, slowly, with actual effort on both sides. My mother never called. Diane sent one more message months later, a brief and somewhat resentful note suggesting that I had made things very difficult at family gatherings by giving interviews about the exhibit. I did not respond to that one at all. Some bridges, I had come to understand, were not mine to rebuild alone, and I no longer felt obligated to carry the weight of maintaining them by myself. The museum exhibit eventually closed, but Eleanor Vance reached out again the following spring with an unexpected offer. The museum wanted to make the exhibit permanent, folding it into their ongoing collection on American family life and forgotten local photographers, with an expanded section that would include a broader retrospective of my professional restoration work. They also asked if I would be willing to teach a workshop series for young photographers from small towns across New England, mentoring the kind of overlooked kids my grandfather had once tried to protect in me. I said yes to all of it. I want to tell you about the day the permanent exhibit officially opened, because it is the moment I think of whenever I try to explain what real justice actually feels like. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not involve screaming matches or slammed doors or anyone getting exactly what they deserve in some cinematic, satisfying instant. Real justice, I have learned, often looks like a quiet Sunday afternoon in a museum gallery, sunlight coming through tall windows, strangers walking slowly past photographs, stopping, reading the small placard beside each one, understanding a story that took years to fully come together. I stood near the back of the gallery that day, watching a young girl, maybe 10 years old, standing in front of the photograph of me at 9, holding my grandfather's camera. She tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed at the photo, asking a question I could not quite hear. Her mother crouched down beside her, reading the placard aloud, then reading my grandfather's handwritten note. The little girl turned and looked around the gallery until she found me standing nearby, wearing the small name badge the museum had given me for the opening. Her eyes widened. "Is that you?" she asked. "In the picture?" "It is," I told her, kneeling down to her level. "I was about your age." "Your family must be really proud of you," she said simply, the way children say things without understanding the weight behind them. I thought about the bucket of ashes in my mother's kitchen. I thought about 11 years of silence, of birthdays uncelebrated, of a graduation no one attended. I thought about my father's voice cracking on the phone and my grandfather's handwriting waiting patiently for over a decade in a schoolteacher's attic, and Margaret Doyle, a woman I had never properly thanked, who had quietly ensured that a little girl's talent would not be forgotten, no matter what her own family decided to do with it. Some of them are, I told the little girl, and I meant it honestly. But you know what I've learned? You don't need every single person in your family to be proud of you in order to build something meaningful. Sometimes the people who believe in you aren't the ones you expect. Sometimes you have to build your own family out of the people who actually show up. Her mother smiled at me, a knowing, gentle smile, the kind shared between strangers who somehow understand each other completely in a single glance. I did not seek revenge against my parents that day or any day after. I never confronted my mother directly about the burned photographs. I never demanded an apology from Diane. I did not need to. The truth had done what I could never have accomplished through anger or confrontation. It had simply waited, patiently, preserved by people who valued it, until the moment it was ready to speak for itself. My father and I built a slow, careful relationship over the following 2 years, meeting occasionally for coffee, exchanging honest and sometimes difficult conversations about the family we had both lost pieces of. My mother remained distant, unwilling or unable to face what she had done, and I made peace with the possibility that some relationships simply do not heal, no matter how much time passes. Diane and I have not spoken since her last resentful message, and I have stopped waiting for that to change. But every year, on the anniversary of the exhibit's permanent opening, I return to that Boston museum and stand quietly in front of the photograph of a 9-year-old girl holding a camera nearly as big as her own body, grinning at a grandfather who believed in her long before the rest of the world caught up. I think about how my parents once tried to erase me from every photograph they could find, believing, in their own broken way, that removing the evidence would somehow remove the truth. I think about how they never understood that the truth does not need permission to exist. It simply waits, patient and quiet, for someone willing to preserve it, until the day it finds its way home. That, I have come to believe, is the only kind of revenge worth having. Not fire, not fury, not confrontation shouted across a kitchen table. Just the truth, carefully kept, patiently restored, and finally, unmistakably seen.